We come in our study today to the 14th century, and that is a time of reversal for the church. Maybe it's a time of transition for the church. We've been looking at the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages would be the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th centuries. And that all came crashing to an end about 1300. What was true of the church was true of civilization generally. The flowering of the Middle Ages was over, and the 14th century was a century of disaster, of war, of pestilence, of religious confusion, of rebellion against authority. Strange things happened. Barbara Tuchman has analyzed the 14th century in a book called A Distant Mirror. It's an incredible time indeed. And whatever was true of the church was true of society, because in the Middle Ages there was no separation between church and society. It was a Christian society. It was Christendom. And the church embraced all. And as the fortunes of the medieval world increased, and we have this glorious flowering of the Middle Ages in the 13th century, so the strength of the church also increased, and the power and the glory of the church, at least from a worldly standpoint, increased. And we have traced that development of the papacy and the power of the papacy, particularly through three very, very powerful popes. The third of them we haven't yet really dealt with, and we'll talk about him tonight, but obviously the first two would be Gregory VII and Innocent III, with the papacy reaching its apex at the time of Innocent III between 1198 and 1216. But in the years after Innocent, the struggle between the German emperors and the popes increased, intensified. Both the German emperor and the Roman pontiff were laying claim to what we might call universal sovereignty, the right to rule the world, and the exclusive right to do so. And we can't have two potentates successfully, validly claiming the same position at the same time. Now the result was they canceled each other out. The result was a struggle to the death. We've looked somewhat at that. When Innocent died in 1216, he had brought to power in his later years the young Frederick II, Hohenstaufen, whom he had reared. He was his guardian because Frederick was orphaned, his parents dying of the plague. And Frederick turned out to be the enemy of the church, not the friend of the church, and consequently there was a gigantic struggle between Frederick II, the Emperor of Germany, and two popes, Innocent IV and Gregory IX. That culminated really with Frederick's death in 1250. And after that time, the German Empire, exhausted by the struggle, began to decline. And in the 1260s, the papacy would take the capital of the German Empire, which at that time was in Sicily, in Palermo, the whole island of Sicily, as a matter of fact, and give it to the French, to Charles of Anjou. And the very fact that the papacy could take the capital of the German Empire and give it to the French was an indication that the German Empire had really gone into a tailspin. It was still there, and it remained in title until 1806, but certainly had lost the great power of the Hohenstaufens. By this time, the Habsburgs, or shortly thereafter, the Habsburgs came to power, 1273, and the Habsburgs never had the power that the Hohenstaufens had. Now, what the papacy didn't understand is that it also had been weakened in that great struggle, that struggle to the death between the papacy and the German Empire. The papacy had given Sicily to the French, but in 1282, the Sicilians arose on the signal of the ringing of the Vesper bells one day and massacred the French and drove them out. As Sir Stephen Runciman has analyzed in his book entitled The Sicilian Vespers, That incident was a barometer. It measured something. It measured the weakness, in fact, the decline of both the papacy and the German Empire. The German Empire, from the fact that it lost its capital and could not retain it and was confined pretty much to the German-speaking areas then, and the papacy from the fact that it could not back up its decision, make it stick, to give this island of Sicily to the French. But the papacy probably failed to realize the significance of the Sicilian Vespers. 12 years later, in 1294, Boniface VIII was elected pope. Boniface VIII probably represented the culmination of corruption within the papacy. Now, he was a strong figure, no question about that. But his moral character was disgraceful. Probably the most disgraceful pope who, with maybe one exception we'll talk about later, but one of the most disgraceful popes ever to occupy the so-called See of Peter. He kept very low company. His friends were immoral. He believed in magic and charms. Personally, he was a skeptic. When he came to power, he boasted, "I am Pope, I am Caesar." Give you some idea about this man. Now, what Boniface, in all of his arrogance, his moral corruption, and his lack of true religious faith, what Boniface failed to understand is that in the intervening years, granted, the German Empire had become very, very weak. It was no longer a great rival, a great problem to the papacy. But what he ignored was the rise of other nations, of nation-states, who were rising to power in a very modern way, not a medieval way at all. In particular, two nations, France and England, both of which were under very capable and aggressive leadership. England at this time was led by Edward I. You may know him as Longshanks if you saw the movie Braveheart. Edward was willing to bring common people into the army and to employ the awesome new invention of the longbow, which he could use very effectively. He ruled by law. He was able to gain control over the nation, over the nobility, particularly because he had the support of the commoners and the middle class at a time when England was growing economically. And the kings were wise enough to take sides with the middle class, that growing middle class, as the nobility was left without power and function. And so in one regard, Edward became a very modern type ruler with a good deal of power, riding high on the crest of not only economic prosperity, but a new spirit of English nationalism. Now the same was true, to some degree at least, in France, where the ruler was Philip IV, otherwise known as Philip the Handsome, very capable king, very powerful king. What Boniface did not see was a great showdown was about to occur between him and these two monarchs. And the difference that would exist between this showdown and the earlier showdown of the 13th century between Frederick II of Germany and the popes is that it would not be a draw this time. It would be a decisive victory for rising European nationalism. Now we've noticed in the conflict, the ongoing conflict between the political rulers and the papacy, that the ultimate question is, who shall rule? Now many of the popes, from a spirit of conviction, felt, we are the legally constituted, divinely authorized representatives of Christ, and in view of the fact that God is sovereign over his kingdom, we as the vicar of Christ rightfully should be, the rulers of the world. The kings and emperors saw that they were divinely authorized also to assume their position as head of the state. And so they both argued from a biblical perspective, and the quarrel was a political one, in essence, who shall rule over God's kingdom, God's Christendom, which would really be Europe. Now, the situation had been manifested in various expressions of conflict, but always the ultimate issue was who shall rule. But if we think back, if you look back, you remember one of the issues was who invests the bishop? Does the Pope or does the king or emperor invest the bishop? And that was called the investiture controversy. And then remember there was the conflict over who would try a clergyman, church court or civil court, king's court. This was the conflict between Henry II of England and Thomas Becket. Now a new conflict emerges, but it's the same ultimate question of who rules. This particular conflict is, can the king tax the clergy? Throughout the Middle Ages, there had been an understanding that the clergy would not be taxed. But with the rise of nationalism, the kings need the income for their new armies and their expansionistic plans, and they really don't see any reason to honor that old agreement, that old understanding. And so Philip IV of France made moves to tax the clergy, whereupon the Pope, Boniface VIII, responded in 1296 with a papal bull entitled Clericos Laicos, which just simply says that the clergy cannot pay taxes to the secular lord. It forbade the clergy to render taxes to Caesar, so to speak. Now, that was not met with much enthusiasm by the King of France or the King of England, who wanted to do the same thing. Edward I of England responded by outlawing the clergy, and Philip IV responded by stopping the exportation of all money from France, particularly money from France to the coffers of Rome. And the Pope was furious. And so he responded in 1297 with a second papal bull. This bull was called Esculti Fili. Remember that papal bulls are always named for the first two words in Latin of the bull, of the proclamation. Esculti Fili means listen, son. So you see that the Pope is taking the posture of being the one in authority, talking to Philip like he was a mischievous little boy, saying, listen, son, I'm talking to you, I'm telling you, you do not tax the clergy. And then Boniface planned to gain support for his viewpoints, to gain support for his program, by planning a gigantic celebration in Rome for the turn of the century. When you see 1297, that's just 3 years from the turn of the century. And in 1300, he planned to have a great jubilee. Usually the church proclaims a jubilee celebration at the turn of any century. And so he proclaimed a great jubilee for Rome in 1300. And he planned to have bishops and cardinals from all over the world there, and to be all kinds of great and wonderful things happen. Now, the historians disagree on how successful that was. Some historians say it was a total fizzle. Others say that it was an impressive number of people and events that were scheduled, but it certainly did not succeed in impressing the King of France with the power of the Pope. And so the king refused to agree to relent from taxing the clergy. Therefore, in 1302, 2 years after the Great Jubilee, Boniface issued what has been known as the ultimate, most exaggerated expression of papal authority and power ever proclaimed by the Roman Church, by the Roman Pope. This is the bull Unum Sanctum, which means one holy body. The idea, of course, is there is one church, and over that one church rules the one pope, and he rules completely. And in the course of this document, which is rather lengthy, there is one phrase that we need to notice. It's always noticed out of the bull Unum Sanctum, because it was later used in the Reformation to point out to people what kind of claim that the papacy really made. But in the bull Unum Sanctum, the statement is made, it is altogether necessary for salvation that every human soul be subject to the Pope of Rome. Now that's very clear. It leaves no room for doubt. If at any point you disobey the Pope, you are going to hell. And that would include a king as well as a commoner. It's not just for commoners. It is for every human soul, and since the king is a human soul, therefore he would be included. He must be subject to the pontiff of Rome and to whatever he says. Now that kind of an exaggerated claim could not go without some type of reaction by the King of France. And so Philip IV responded. He called a council. And councils were the only means available to discipline a pope, because it had been historically understood that councils would be used to decide matters of religion and would be the final arbiter in matters of difference of viewpoint. And so he called a council, but this is still the king's council. It's not the church's council. And the council is called, although there are churchmen present, but churchmen loyal to the king, and they condemned the pope of heresy. Then the king sent his representative to the pope, a man by the name of Guillaume Nogaret, to meet with the pope. He met with him at his mountain retreat in Italy at a place called Anagni. He had every intention of capturing the pope and torturing him. And he did. And in the process, by this time Boniface is an old man and not able to resist the band of French soldiers who come to arrest him. And even though there are those who would protect him and tried to do so, and it caused quite a furor, yet the pope was still arrested. At one point, he was slugged, he fell to the ground, and subsequently he died. Now, he didn't die from his injuries as much as simply from the humiliation of this incident. There was virtually a riot over this arrest of the Pope, and the French cardinals saw that as an opportunity and declared Rome to be unsafe. A new Pope was elected, Clement V, who happened to be French. He then condemned Boniface, took the side of the French king, and agreeing that Rome was unsafe, he literally removed the entire papal office, the administration, the whole church, if you please, from Rome to France, to a small town in southern France called Avignon. And we speak of the Avignon papacy. And for 70 years, over 70 years, the papacy will not be located in Rome, but will be located in France, right under the nose of the French king. All of the popes will be French, and all of them will cooperate with the French king beautifully. Now, the French king claimed that he had nothing to do with this. I don't know whether you believe that or not. But at any rate, there is no longer any conflict between the papacy and the French government. In fact, the papacy for 70 years becomes a department of the French government. And it represents quite a triumph of rising nationalism over the medieval church. Historians often refer to this as the Babylonian captivity of the church, alluding to the 70 years that Judah was in captivity in Babylon. There is no doubt that at this point, the papal monarchy has come to an end. And even though, as we're going to see, the papacy will go back to Rome later on, never again does it gain back its political power over the world. So the papal monarchy is over. It is history at this point. The papacy in Avignon was not necessarily made up of all corrupt popes. Many of them were competent. But their primary concern was to help the church recover from the tremendous financial shock of having been uprooted from Rome. And so they spent most of their time developing new taxes. As a matter of fact, about 200 new taxes to tax members of the church throughout Europe to support the papal government. It was at this time that we find taxes being added, such as fees for funerals and fees for weddings. And of course, the more elaborate the funeral and wedding, then the more fee you'd have to pay to the church. A fee is paid to the Pope for just about anything you want to do. Now, it is significant that the popes during this 70 years, because they were concerned about managing the whole financial structure and administrative structure of the church in a new situation, were not able to give any attention, any significant attention, to the spiritual leadership of the church. Now, that's very important. Now, that doesn't mean to say that many of the popes of the High Middle Ages had given much spiritual direction. Their concern was political power, ruling all of Christendom. The concern of the Avignon popes was primarily administrative and financial. And the concern of later popes, once the papacy returns to Rome, is the glory of the Renaissance and protecting the land that they came back to in Italy, known as the Papal States. And so the papacy was not providing spiritual leadership and not providing answers to the spiritual questions that people were asking. Questions about their salvation, questions about their relationship with God, and how they could know that and be sure of that. That's very important for us to understand that lack of leadership at that level in the church. In 1378, one of the Avignon popes, Gregory XI, went to Rome. Now, he went to Rome with the expressed intention of trying to arrange to return the papacy to Rome. He felt it ought to go back. It belonged in Rome. And while he was working on his program of returning the papacy to Rome, he died in Rome. The Italian cardinals said that was a sign from God that the papacy had come home. Now, they were aided in their efforts by a very brave lady by the name of Catherine of Siena. Known as St. Catherine, she was canonized. Catherine was committed to the idea and prayed that God would bring back the papacy to Rome. Worked very hard to accomplish it, and so the Roman Church today gives much credit to St. Catherine of Siena for having returned the papacy to Rome, which is one reason that she was considered so important that two cities felt they should have her for a place of burial. She came from Siena, so the Sienese thought she should be buried there. Yet the city of Rome felt she had done so much for Rome that she should be buried there. They solved the problem. They cut her head off, after she was dead, of course, buried her head in Siena and her body in Rome. So if you want to visit St. Catherine, you'll have to go to two different cities in Italy. Now, the French cardinals objected to all of this, and they felt this was foul indeed. This was not playing right at all. The Italians had elected Urban VI as the new pope. The French said he's too strict. The French cardinals went back to Avignon. They elected Clement VII, a relative of the French king. Now we have a little problem. We have two popes, an Italian pope and a French pope. So we call that the Great Schism. And it caused mass confusion in the church. People wondered, who is the pope? Who's my pope? Generally, the countries of Spain, France, Scotland, and part of Germany supported the French pope, whereas Italy, most of Germany, England, Scandinavia, Bohemia, Poland, Flanders, and Portugal supported the Italian pope. These two popes died and were replaced by two more popes. By 1409, the situation didn't seem to be resolving itself, and so the decision was to hold a council. Again, councils are called in a time of controversy, and a council was held in Pisa. It elected a new pope, a council pope, if you please. But the other two refused to step down, and now we have the very strange situation of three popes. Not two, but three popes, each claiming to be the true pope of the church. A second council was held at Constance, because the council pope Alexander V had died and was succeeded by John the 23rd. I alluded to a pope who was even more scandalous than Boniface VIII, and John the 23rd would fill that bill. He was about as bad as they get. He and the Emperor Sigismund, the German Emperor Sigismund, had called this Council of Constance. At that time, the Italian pope was Gregory XII, and the French pope was Benedict XIII. The council pope John the 23rd was exposed for his extremely scandalous behavior. He fled, he was arrested, and he was deposed. But the question now arose, who has the ultimate power in the church, pope or council? Gregory resigned because he felt the council should, therefore the council pope should rule. But Benedict refused to do so, saying, oh no, the pope has the power over the council. The result was it was not resolved, and these two were succeeded by two more. Finally, the council elected Martin V, and the two new popes at that time agreed to step down, and only one pope was in power. And he did go back to Rome. He did convene a council at Pavia in 1423 that moved to Siena due to the plague and then was dissolved for disinterest. During the time that councils are being called, we really have what we might call a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy. Martin then called the Council of Basel in Switzerland, which was convened only after his death by the new Pope Eugenius IV, but he tried to reassert the papal supremacy over the council. The German Emperor Sigismund and the council told the Pope to submit, and at that time 2 Italian scholars, Nicholas of Cusa and Lorenzo Valla, proved that the donation of Constantine, which was the document upon which the Pope based his claim to controlling the papal states, was an out-and-out forgery. Indeed it was. But the council went too far in trying to run the church. Eventually it lost support. Another council was held at Florence. It started in Ferrara, was moved to Florence in Italy. They were trying to reunite the churches, the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Roman Church, but that attempt was hindered by the squabbles in the West over who really runs the church and by the unwillingness of people in the East, the Orthodox people, to cooperate. They did not want a reunification with Rome. Eugenius gained control over the council, finally dispersed it in 1448. A new pope came to power, Nicholas V, assumed full control. He was back in Rome, and he turned his attention to the Renaissance, and he became the first Renaissance pope. A rebel council in Lausanne, Switzerland, elected Felix V, who soon abdicated. But the days of council power were over. The church returned to a monarchy, but the papal monarchy that controlled the world was no longer. The popes were no longer political world leaders. In our last study, we'll turn to next time, we're going to be looking at some of the spiritual reactions to these situations.